Hey now, RotoGrinders, welcome back to NFL Preseason 2025. My name is Chris Gimino, elder millennial host of this broadcast, where we will go over the best plays for the Hall of Fame game slate on DraftKings and FanDuel. And joining me is barely a millennial, Kyle Murray. Kyle, this is not our first rodeo, so to speak, discussing preseason football, nor it is our first Hall of Fame game. We've been there for all the Tanner Hudsons and all of the Raheem Mosterts and all of the Bryce Perkins of the world. Are you ready to discuss this absolutely filthy excuse for a football game and get to the bottom of the DFS top plays?
I am, yeah. When I was writing up the article, I mentioned football is back, and then I said, "Well, kind of. We're kind of back. We're getting closer. We do have a little bit of a little dose of football, which is always fun to talk about. I know the people will get going for it. There's been a little bit of a lull in sports, and people love their football. So I think as we're getting ready to gear up, and I think the Hall of Fame game is an almost perfect way to do that.
Last year, you and I went over the last 5 or so Hall of Fame game slates and the winning trends that emerged from that particular telecast. And one thing that we have found over the years is that there is one position, actually two, that play the majority of the football game and score the most fantasy points and lead to our success. Maybe you can tell the people about those positions and maybe some other general strategy that could help somebody make their rosters both in cash games and tournaments for the Hall of Fame game slate.
Yeah, I mean, it's no news to people who've been playing DFS for any amount of time that volume is king. And in the preseason, the only way to really get consistent volume or project for consistent volume is to hopefully project for consistent playing time. And when we're talking about being able to project out consistent playing time, it can be difficult at times to sift through, a team's true motives on what they want to do with a player or with a team throughout the course of the preseason in terms of, analyzing the player's maybe potential role on an upcoming roster, maybe seeing if they're going to be a practice squad type player. So there's a lot of different motives involved in terms of projecting that. But couple of things that we're sure about is the defenses are going to be on the field all 4 quarters. Obviously, you can take players out of the defense, but you're still going to earn points for that defensive unit. So they have an inherent advantage in these showdown slates, especially in preseason where we're not seeing a ton of scoring. I mean, this game has a 34.5, 33.5 implied total here. So you're not expecting a ton of scoring. So your defense is already going to look good as is. And then when you consider the fact that they can gain points throughout all 4 quarters, while other players are most likely going to be pulled out, whether it be a quarter, a half, a drive, 2 drives, whatever it may be. Typically, you're not seeing players play full games in the preseason. So defenses have that inherent advantage. And when kickers aren't going through a kicking competition like the 2 tonight for this Hall of Fame game, no competitive kickers in this one. So it's just the 2 solo kickers. They're also going to be out there for 4 quarters. And kicking opportunities, might be tough to come by at times in terms of looking for scoring opportunities, but 140 or 150-yard field goal can easily pay off in terms of beating a large portion of the player pool when you're talking 4 or 5 points being a pretty solid score, especially when you're talking about projecting a more of a safer median projection for these guys. So I do think kickers and defenses are going to have those inherent advantages just by being able to be on the field for all 4 quarters. And then for this game, we do have a couple of pretty solid quarterback options as well. Both teams are expected to only play 2 quarterbacks. We've actually gotten pretty solid news about the Chargers side as well. So I do think it's a pretty good spot for the quarterbacks in this one as well. But it's definitely worth noting that, again, in case anybody hasn't played a preseason showdown slate before, these defenses and these kickers do have an inherent advantage, especially from a safety and less volatile perspective.
I'm thinking about range of outcomes. Big plays are hard to come by. We have seen some big plays in the last couple of years. From the Jaguars a couple of years ago. Last year, we saw Colin Johnson go off and steal the show in the Hall of Fame game slate. There can be big performances. 2 touchdowns, extremely rare. As a matter of fact, you look at most props out there for extra points, 1.5 favored to the under for the most part. You're not really expecting the entire team to score 2 touchdowns most of the time. Therefore, you're really not expecting players to be scoring 2 touchdowns. So one will definitely do an absolute load of damage. Thinking about your quarterbacks in this one, that's why maybe we can rely not just on the idea that we want quarterbacks who are going to play a lot of time, but maybe there are some other traits our quarterbacks can possess that will give us some confidence in really trying to consider them top plays on the slate, because quite frankly, you don't need a whole lot to really get yourself to the top of these leaderboards production-wise.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always nice to hope that you can find a player with the big play upside, but like I mentioned, a 50-yard field goal and maybe a 30-yard field goal, a 2 field goal game, whatever it may be, an 8, 9 point performance, especially on a showdown slate, can really be not only a guy who can enter an optimal lineup, but also be a very strong score in terms of just looking at the entire player pool in this one. So yeah, that 100% there's going to be low scoring, which opens up these bigger plays or even these chunk plays as potential spots to find game breaking points production.
Yep, and a quarterback who can take off will certainly help us get to where we want to go. Running backs volume, like you said, is the king when we're looking at that position. I think that's the other key position is trying to find the middle to lower tier depth chart running backs who are going to be out there for the most amount of plays. Certainly, if the player has talent, we want to lean into that quite a bit. A lot of people are going to wake up tomorrow and they're going to want to click the button on Omari and Hampton. A lot of people are going to be looking at players on the wide receiver side of the ball, and they're going to want to get into Trey Harris and Isaac Tisla. But really, Kyle, it's the middle of that depth chart to the bottom of that depth chart where we're really going to find the most snaps in this game.
Yeah, definitely. I think the big names can definitely stick out to people, especially maybe more casual players, especially on a showdown slate. And in preseason, we're not going to have salary restraints. Everybody's the same cost, so that allows players to fill out their lineups with whoever they want. So with that being the case, some of these names, especially some of these exciting rookies, Hampton is definitely one that's going to potentially get people in some trouble in this Hall of Fame game. So yeah, it's definitely a good point, especially considering that people can play whoever they want. And we've seen at times people start quarterbacks who were never even in contention to play. I'm sure we'll have some Jared Goff and some Justin Herbert lineups out there tomorrow, maybe not a ton. But back in the day, we used to see several occurrences where you have guys rostering players who just weren't ever going to play. So it does open up some things in the preseason, especially with the lack of salary cap being in the conversation for this one.
All right, let's get into the core plays. Let's not bury the lead. We talked about it at the top here. I don't know if we want to say top captain option for sure when we talk about the defense. They're definitely in contention. No question. A lot of people are going to play the defense and special teams as the captain. Let's talk about the strategy here, though. These are going to be the highest owned positions on the slate. This is not a secret anymore. Everyone's playing the defenses tomorrow. Break it down. Which defenses do you like of these two defenses, Kyle? Where can we evaluate our strategy for DFS when we're playing on this very massive showdown slate? DraftKings has a very nice contest out there that we're going to be looking to try to get up the top of the leaderboard on. What are we doing with the defenses when it comes to the captain position?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, it's a low total. It's actually down to 32.5 now over on FanDuel. So we're not expecting a ton of production. So that's automatically going to have the defenses look pretty viable. And then again, the advantage of them being able to be out there and earning points for 4 quarters. They can also lose points, get negative as a defense. But again, with the lack of offensive production being expected, it's probably less of an occurrence as it would be in a regular season game or in a game with 50.5 total there. So the defenses definitely make their way to the top. In terms of picking the favorites, I think for me, the Lions are probably going to be my favorite defense just because they have the Vegas advantage, right? They're favored to win this one. They're favored to score more points, and therefore the Chargers are expected to score less through Vegas. But when you look at Trey Lance, he had a great preseason last year, right? He's expected to play through the second half and into a drive in the third quarter. So we're going to see a lot of Trey Lance. He was one of the preseason darlings, especially at the quarterback position last year. He still threw 5 interceptions in the preseason in 3 games. So obviously he's a guy who can turn the ball over. I think he had 2 fumbles as well. So those turnovers are going to be options out there. So this Lions team is one that I think I'd probably slightly prefer over the Chargers. But again, I do think both defenses are core plays. And to your point about, I guess, top captain options, I still think that there's players out there, especially both of these quarterbacks that we're going to like the most, that have a higher ceiling for maybe a better captain option, especially in tournaments. But from a safety perspective, these defenses are likely 2 of the safer options on the board.
The yards per attempt leaves something to be desired for Trey Lance when it comes to the regular season and certainly the preseason out there. So the rushing upside is where we're thinking about him when we're playing him as a player. But like you mentioned, all of the turnover potential is something that could give us a nice piece of the defensive scoring pie here in this game. DJU, of course, the player who's going to come in after Lance on the Chargers. And once again, just some additional upside there. Describing him as raw seems fair. So outside of the defense position, what other captains do you think we should start considering? If we're bumping down the next, we'll say call it the most likely top scorers on the slate, who's the next two most likely top scorers on the slate?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the two quarterbacks that we saw make pretty good impressions from a preseason perspective last year, Trey Lance and Hendon Hooker. Already talked about Lance's expected playing time, 662 passing yards last year in the preseason in 3 games, also threw for 2 touchdowns while adding 7 rush attempts per game for 168 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns as well. So the dual threat upside there for Trey Lance. I mean, again, you're probably not going to be projecting like a ceiling outcome for a defense to be anything over, 14, 15 points outside of like maybe a spot where they get a defensive touchdown, which is surely possible in the Hall of Fame game. So, I mean, if Trey Lance sneaks one in and throws one and racks up these yards and these rushing yards, he's probably going to be the guy with the higher ceiling compared to the two defenses. Hendon Hooker also had a strong preseason last year as well, 19 rush attempts last year in his 3 games for 138 rushing yards and a touchdown, also averaged 100 passing yards per game while throwing 1 touchdown and an interception. So I think both of these guys are fairly high, preseason ceiling options as well. Like even if it was a full slate, I think both these guys would probably look pretty good. So I think, both of these guys have that dual threat upside to be the top scorers. And I would say these two probably have slightly higher ceilings than the defense, but I do think those defenses just have a better medium projection right now. But Lance and Hooker are probably the next 2 captain options for me.
Yeah, there are a couple players in this game who had really strong college prospects derailed by ACL injuries. And I do think that Hooker is, I won't say under the radar, but the quality of his potential play in the NFL, I don't think has actually been observed. Even last year, the preseason was not exactly a massive window into what he could become as a player. He's still young. So, I mean, there's a potential that this is actually a really good quarterback playing in this game. So you definitely do want to consider Hooker here. He's going to be extremely popular. That's, again, that's something for you to consider for strategy considerations here as you go to construct your lineups. If you're making 1, 2, 3 lineups, of course, you're going to be using Hendon Hooker. If you're going to be making a whole lot of lineups, you might want to start thinking about some ways to diversify that exposure, because ultimately, no matter how good a prospect looks with the amount of playing time that we're talking about, it is quite easy to go 0 for 3, 0 for 4, 0 for 5 on drives and not score any fantasy points. We've seen that. So we do want to be aware of that as we construct a fleet if we are mass multi-entering tournaments. Let's get into the secondary plays. Players that we think could be high up on our tiers, maybe even slide into those captain slots in our mass multi-entry pools. Maybe not necessarily quite the same quality of plays as the 4 we just talked about. So when we get into our second tier plays, Kyle, where are we starting? Where do we start to look for a baseline in our showdown lineups?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think you can build a lot of lineups without necessarily going too far off the board. And when I say off the board, I mean the 3 positions that we've been talking about the most: quarterback, kicker, and defense. I think outside of those guys on a showdown slate where you don't need to roster these other positions, I think those guys can also be considered tournament plays unless there's some really viable options. And we'll talk about the running back room and the wide receiver room being a little bit deeper for this Hall of Fame game for both sides. So for me, it's the kickers that I'm looking at next: Bates and Cameron Dicker. Both these guys were 2 of the better fantasy kickers in football last year. Obviously, it's a totally different environment with these 2 guys. I mean, we should not be expecting the same amount of potential field goal attempts, extra point attempts with the backup options for the offenses for Detroit and the Chargers. But nonetheless, both have big legs, so we could easily see them just slightly get into field goal range and try it out there for a 55 to 60-yard field goal, and both of them have really good chances to go out there and make that. So I do think that these are 2 good kickers. I don't think we need to be necessarily analyzing the skill set of kickers too much, but that certainly does not hurt that they have the ability to go out there and make the longer range field goals. Both of those guys showed that as well. So Bates and Dicker are the 2 guys I'm looking at next. And then after that, it's the 2 other quarterbacks that we have in this game. DJU, who we talked about a little bit. This is kind of a guy who's, I think, a big question mark for preseason. He's technically the 4th string quarterback for the Chargers coming into this one. Taylor Heineke's going to just be the emergency quarterback. DJU was bad in college. He went to Oregon State. Went to Clemson. And he was a big name there, then had to transfer to Oregon State, didn't pan out there, went to Florida State for a little bit, just hasn't really panned out anywhere in college after being a massive prospect, but he's getting a shot here. he still is one of those guys who's going to profile as having dual threat upside. He's going to, I'm sure, look to run as much as possible and show off that he can, escape and create plays there. But nonetheless, this is a guy whose skill set I do think could potentially work out for preseason, but it also could be ugly from a passing perspective. Then Kyle Allen is expected to get the non-Hendon Hooker drives for the Lions offense. And this is a guy who we've seen get some playing time in NFL regular season games. So that certainly does not hurt. And again, you do have to consider the fact that he's probably the least quarterback the quarterback with the least amount of rushing upside, probably one of the better passers in this game. So we'll see how that plays out for him in this one, but he's certainly in play in that next tier for me.
Yeah, as a passer, I think he's the kind of guy when I'm looking at the wide receivers on Detroit that I want to try to pair up. If I am going to be trying to make some stacks here, necessarily Hendon Hooker is not absolutely going to be someone that has to get it done through the air. He's a guy you can run. You mentioned 19 rush attempts last preseason. Kyle Allen, I think, is the better passer of the two, or at least he's the one with the more established track record of producing in the preseason and the more experience in the NFL. And I do think that looking at the receivers on Detroit, if you're trying to make a stack of any kind, I would be looking to pair him up with the late game options on Detroit. At least that's how I'm going to approach it here. Kyle, do you have any countermeasures or counterpoints to that thought?
No, I think that's definitely a good way to approach it. I think in terms of looking at a guy who could potentially have the most pass attempts in the game, I think he's arguably up there because he's just going to be looking to run less than these guys, and he does project for at least currently, while we haven't had necessarily guaranteed news on expected playing time for the Lions quarterbacks, but if we're going to assume that they're going to be splitting it 50-50, he's probably going to be the guy that I would project to have the most pass attempts, just considering the fact that he's going to look to run less than the three other quarterbacks in this game.
Let's break down the Lions running back situation, because we do have in our second tier, in our secondary tier, one running back from the Lions, but I do think that that's variable based on who we find out is going to be available in the game. So the injury report, as we understand it, is Sayon Baki, former defensive player converted to running back for the Lions, has had some issues with injury both this year and last year, banged up, smaller injury types, but in the preseason, we certainly were looking to him. And he just got back to practice. So his first practice was limited. We don't know the extent in which he will play for sure in this game. When you look at the prop markets over on Prize Picks, you're not seeing his name right now. You are seeing one of the other running backs, Jabari Small, with the highest rushing total. So people aren't really sure whether we're going to see Vaki in this game. We're also not sure if we're going to see Kai Robichaud, who is a draft pick coming in this season, or I should say one of the top options in a vacuum if we know he's healthy, but he did leave practice this week. So what are we doing here with the running backs for the Lions? How are you breaking this down? How are you approaching it from a strategy perspective?
Yeah, I think from a strategy perspective, best case scenario from like a game theory perspective is that we get the news as late as possible, and we can sort of build around that later. So I would say, make sure you're checking updated projections in the Discord, updated tiers in our tiers article, just to confirm that what we're going to see from this Lions depth chart. They did go out and sign Jacob Sailors yesterday, so that kind of does point in the direction that maybe one of these guys won't be available, or at least significantly limited. Baki is a guy who he's probably going to have a role in the offseason, or in the offense, or in the special teams specifically in the regular season. But nonetheless, he's certainly a guy that they would like to see in the preseason. But if he has a hamstring injury that's holding him back, I'm not 100% sure they're going to run him out there. But again, he could be back to full go. He could be certainly fine to go here. So I think the best case scenario, for clarity purposes, we get a good report on the running back room. But for a game theory perspective, hopefully that news comes as late as possible, where people aren't able to react or react properly. So I think if he's the one that we get good news on him, he's full go, he's the guy that I am most interested in here. He averaged, he had a very efficient preseason last year, averaging over 7 yards per carry. Obviously, it's going to be something that we're probably not expecting, but that did happen for him in college as well. So he's shown to be an explosive player. So also has some receiving chops as well. So he's going to be probably my favorite running back if we do get positive news. But I also will say, if we don't get any news on Vaki and he is going to be one of the more popular running backs, it's probably the most volatile position out of all these guys, other than maybe Robichaud, who left practice a couple days ago. I would assume he's probably more questionable than Vaki, considering Vaki's been practicing the last couple days. Robichaud left early. So from a game theory perspective, if we get no news, Vaki's probably a guy I would take a lighter stance on, just because he's probably going to have more volatility in maybe his availability or how limited he's going to be. And if that's the case, Jabari Small is probably the guy that I'm looking at the most. But, based on looking at the prop market here, he's the one with the rushing prop that we're seeing for the Lions. So he's probably going to be the popular option as well. So it's going to come down to the news and, ownership for Vaki for me.
Counterpoint on Jabari Small. He almost certainly stinks at pro football, between the tackles grinder for the most part. Same is true for Kai Robichaud, probably a little bit more burst coming out of Robichaud. So you certainly like that as a between the tackles grinder in this game. You would have wished you knew for sure that he was getting volume. You don't know that he's not, right? We don't have the information yet. But Vaki is certainly the more versatile of those players. To be honest, if they had signed Sailors sooner than a couple of days before the game, I might actually have more interest in him coming from the UFL. Known threat in the passing game in that league. The quality of play in this game, not necessarily night and day compared to what we'll see in the UFL. Talking about the backups, third string, fourth string players in the NFL. A lot of those players in the UFL played in preseason football in years past. So Sailors is certainly someone that, with more information, might like a little bit more. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. But again, we're talking about those top backs for the Lions. Vaki in a vacuum, the best, but there are some injury concerns there with him and Kai Robichaud. Let's get into some of the other plays that we're talking about on the Chargers side when it gets to the running back position. Break it down. A lot of people are going to turn to Marion Hampton, despite what some of the more seasoned DFS players will think about that strategy. How are we dealing with it? Because quite frankly, he's not ruled out. So, we've seen the Josh Jacobs situation from years past, right? Everyone thinks Josh Jacobs is not playing. Guy plays more than a quarter. You see more than a quarter of Omari and Hampton and you don't have him, you're going to be absolutely shitting yourself, Kyle. So what are we doing?
Yeah, I think, for me, the way I'm approaching it is it's going to be a pretty fade that I'm happy to make, just because, again, we are expecting them to be cautious here with him. Obviously, with Najee Harris dealing with his potential injury that could linger into the regular season, we don't really know, the timeline or the full situation there. But if Hampton's going to maybe not even be the lead back, but just be a guy who's going to be getting 10 to 15 carries a game, whatever their potential role is for him in the regular season, I don't expect them to go out there and use him a ton. I think it could be a spot where, we saw it last year with Malik Neighbors in their first preseason game, where they just wanted to simply go out there and put their new rookie out there on the field for a few plays, maybe give him the ball a couple times, get some excitement going for the fans. But I don't think it's a spot where we're likely going to see Hampton go out there and get, quarter work in this preseason game. If that happens, like you mentioned, we're probably in trouble. But I do think that the world where maybe 30 plus 25% of people see Hampton, see that he's going to play in the game. They came out and said he's going to play in the game. If I think you're better off fading him there at that 25, 30% number, whatever it may be, and then hope that what comes to fruition is maybe a drive, maybe two drives, and not a ton of production there for Hampton. So after that, obviously not going to see Najee Harris. You have a kind of an interesting backfield for the Chargers, because you have a few guys that we've seen a handful of times. We've seen Hassan Haskins play in the preseason 3 times. We've seen Jarrett Patterson over the last 4 or 5 years. Kamani Vidal was a kind of a preseason darling last year, or at least for fantasy draft for season long. So there's a couple, recognizable names here, and then Nyheim Hines as well. Raheem Sanders, anyone who's in the college DFS streets, he's been a workhorse in college football over the last couple of years for a couple different schools. So I think that it's sort of interesting here, because you have Patterson and Hassan Haskins, and I do think Nyheim Hines to an extent. They're all kind of known commodities. And, I wouldn't say they're necessarily older guys. Hassan Haskins is fairly young still, but the Chargers know what they have with these 3. So I think for me, Sanders and Vidal are going to be my 2 favorites for the Chargers backfield. I'm assuming that these are 2 guys that they're going to want to get a better look at here and potentially see what they can do. Vidal had a couple of chances in the regular season last year, and he just wasn't able to seize that role. Obviously, the Chargers going out and getting Hampton, getting Najee Harris, they don't really seem to have a ton of confidence in Vidal. So I think the preseason could be a good spot to kind of give him a showcase opportunity.
Oh, when he was at Arkansas, Sanders was workhorse is one way to put it. Like, he absolutely crushed 2022. Yeah. Then he had the injury. 2023 was a complete wash, disappeared into the ether. 2024, not necessarily the closeout season you would have liked to seen him had at South Carolina. Therefore, basically an afterthought in this year's loaded running back draft class. Kyle, he could be a hidden gem. We don't know exactly to what degree, right? There's a couple of those backs that came out this year. Ollie Gordon, Rocket Sanders, guys he thought might be at the top of their draft class, didn't really make it there. Certainly far overshadowed by Hampton and his status this year. But Sanders, this is his moment. So I definitely will be interested in Sanders, provided confirmation of his health. He did have a little bit of, I believe it was a soft tissue issue recently, but upon that confirmation, I will certainly be very interested in him. Certainly got the profile of someone who, if he gets the rock, could succeed. Scroll on the list here, because if we're not getting dirty enough with our 4th, 5th string running backs on the Chargers and the Lions, getting into passing game options is even worse, because number one, the quarterbacks are usually not that great in these games. Number two, the reps are few and far between, even for the guys that you think are going to play the most. Start with the Chargers. Where are we looking at the wide receiver position? Someone who could have a big spike, because I think that's the one thing that you do get at wide receiver, one big play, and you could be in the optimal lineup. Give me an option that you think could fit that profile.
Yeah, I think I guess a quick anecdote on receivers in the preseason is, sometimes playing time is not as easily translated to touches or to opportunity, especially on teams like both of these teams that have fairly deep receiving rooms. I think you can look no further than Brendan Rice from last year in the preseason, when he had 12 targets throughout 3 games that turned into just 1 catch. So that can easily be an indicator of what you can expect from receivers at times. You can even be on the right spot from a volume perspective. And like you alluded to, the quarterback play is probably not going to be all that great. The offenses are going to be in a little bit of confusion with, moving guys in and out, playing with guys that they haven't really played with before. So I do think from a pass catching perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty, not only from playing time, but also just production and potential ease of play getting into these games. So I think that Brendan Rice stat line was a good point of just what you can maybe potentially expect at times from these wide receivers and why they kind of fall down the list. Sure, you can have guys like Colin Johnson from last year who scores a couple times, or maybe a guy who breaks a long one, like Calvin Austin did a couple years ago in a Steelers preseason game. You do have those options. But for me on the Chargers, I think the guy who's getting the most buzz in the preseason, and I guess in training camp, is Keandre Lambert-Smith, obviously with Mike Williams retiring. Trey Harris and Lambert-Smith are both getting some more attention. But in terms of who we could potentially see more in this Hall of Fame game, I do think Lambert-Smith gets the edge there. So he's probably going to be my favorite Chargers option. I don't think that's going to be a unique take. Rice, like I mentioned last year, he was a guy who was able to earn some targets, didn't turn into anything. So I guess we'll potentially see if that ability to separate or earn targets is going to carry over to the season. So he's another guy that I do have some interest in. And then Fitzpatrick, Des Fitzpatrick is a guy we've also seen make some big plays at times. His rookie year in his preseason, I do believe he had a 30 or 40-yard touchdown with the Titans. So those are probably the top 3 guys that I'm looking at here for the Chargers. Trey Harris is going to be a fade for me because of the fact that I do think people are going to see that name, that very recognizable name, especially people who played college DFS. And I'm just not expecting a ton of playing time for him, especially with the fact that I do think he's kind of looped into that Amari Hampton role. I think it makes sense to, if you're going to play those guys, play both of them together, and maybe they do play more. But for me, probably going to be off of both of these Chargers top rookies, Harris and Hampton, and be looking at guys more like Lambert-Smith and Brendan Rice.
Yeah, he wasn't in the street clothes list. The Chargers did do us a favor and put out a street clothes list in advance, and Trey Harris wasn't on it. So of the 2 guys, Hampton and Trey Harris, I think there's probably a better chance that we would see Trey Harris play deeper into the game. I don't know that with the amount of running backs that we have in the situation in Los Angeles that we're going to see Hampton get more than just some contact on his body. But Harris could, certainly outplay the people he's up against in this game, make a big play early. He would, if you're going to be mixing in one of those 2 guys, I would lean in the direction of Harris. But yeah, you nailed it. Lambert-Smith is going to probably see more playing time. He's been the darling of camp. He's got speed, so he could turn something into a big play if necessary. But otherwise, just difficult to absolutely get overly confident about any wide receiver on really anywhere, but certainly on the Chargers. On the Lions side, though, maybe not as clear cut of a number one option for this game. I think you and I both agree that there's one clear best player. Is he going to actually play?
Yeah, definitely. That's going to be the case here. And for me, if we'd run the show maybe a week and a half ago, I probably would have thought that Tesla was going to be a pretty good preseason option. But I do think that potentially reading the tea leaves a little bit throughout the kind of what the Lions plan to do in this one, with a couple of their other rookies, their key rookies, Ratledge and Tyler Williams, both sitting out. I mean, these are guys who are not quite Isaac Tesla, right? Tesla's a third-round pick, while Ratledge was an early second-round pick, and Tyler Williams was a first-round pick. But I do think it's still a potential indicator there, right? Especially if you're on the side of thinking that Tesla has a really good chance to open up the season as the wide receiver 3 in this Detroit offense. I mean, we've heard it throughout the draft process, all pretty much since the Lions traded up and shocked many people to draft Isaac Tesla before. I mean, they probably could have waited another round on him. Honestly, they like this guy that much. So I think there's a kind of a two-pronged argument with Tesla where, they could potentially be a little bit cautious with him and maybe give him a treatment similar to Trey Harris, where they just want to get him a few reps, or maybe they need him to prove that he can be a wide receiver 3 option. But for me, I think the more likely outcome, especially from a game theory perspective, that I think you can get the most value out of is people seeing the name that we've been hearing since the draft and wanting to jam him into lineups. And then he's a guy who's potentially limited because of his role in regular season plans for the Lions. So for me, Lovett is the one I'm looking at the most here. He's been getting a good amount of hype in the preseason as well in training camp. He was a guy who was very productive in college as well. So Lovett's a guy who I think is probably the bubble receiver that has more of a case for playing time. So I think even if you believe that Tesla's going to be out there, I still think Lovett is likely a guy who is out there for more playing time, just because I think he's a bubble receiver who's probably going to be expecting to play more in this one. A couple other guys that have been getting some buzz, Jacoby, Kenny James, and then Jackson Meeks as well. Another guy who I do have some interest in is Malik Taylor. Malik Taylor had a big 2023 preseason. He had 3 catches, and he still averaged over 28 yards per reception. So he's a big play, dynamic type playmaker. Didn't play last year in the preseason. We did see him at times in the regular season for the Jets, but he's a guy who I also have my eye on as maybe that big play threat here for the Lions. And then you do have another guy who was a preseason darling a few years ago, Tom Kennedy, who I do think is probably more likely on the outs from a playing time perspective, because, again, we've seen him on the Lions for 3 preseasons in a row now, and they have all these unknown sort of assets that I do think that they're going to probably give more time to get out there and earn some playing time and get some reps. So those are the 3 that I'm looking at the most.
There's a very weird category of professional football player that is not good enough to make the 53-man roster, or not good enough to actually play if they are on it every couple of weeks from the practice squad. Tom Kennedy is certainly on that list. Makes all of his appearance in the preseason, then we don't see him for a year, or we barely see him for a year. There's a couple of guys like that. DJ Montgomery, Indianapolis. Certainly Tanner Hudson, who's actually getting some playing time now with the Bengals, but not always the case. Back when he was with Tampa, he would just disappear. These guys are just career preseason players, and I do think Kennedy, for what it's worth, is probably going to strap it up for this game and get out there, and he's got the skills for the contested catch and the ability to make a play. So there's not a 0% chance there with Kennedy. You got any parting shots for us, Kyle? When we talked about a lot of players here, we haven't really isolated sort of a favorite play, so to speak, a play that could, if you were looking to say, this is the guy that I think has the best combination of upside and differentiation on this slate, where are you looking on this big long list in the tiers? And when we've got our core plays, we know we're going to play those guys. We like our quarterbacks. We even like some of the top running backs. But where are you ultimately pinning down the flag for this preseason slate?
Yeah, I think the fact that it's a showdown slate even kind of gives you a chance to play some of these receivers and still, get some leverage there, because many people just aren't going to go to any receivers at all. So you can play a couple of the top receivers that I think people are, if this was a full slate, like Lambert Smith would probably be one of the more popular receiving options, just because people have seen his name a lot and he should have a pretty solid role. So he's probably one that stands out as a guy who I think people will still like or consider, but not necessarily play as much, just because, again, people just aren't really dipping outside of the 3-position quarterback, defense, kicker range all that much. And if they do, it's probably going to be the running backs more than receivers. So Lambert Smith's probably the receiver that I'm looking at the most. The running back right now for me is probably going to be either Raheem Sanders or Kamani Badal. And then again, it's sort of tough to gauge the decision on the Lions running back room right now because, again, that injury status I think is going to be very important. So again, definitely check in on updated projections and in the Discord for any news that we might get on these Lions running backs for sure.
Yeah, I think DJU probably stinks, but he's going to play enough in this game that if he ended up scoring a touchdown with his legs, maybe, God forbid, he actually throws one, there could actually be some advantage there because I don't think he's going to be the first click in everyone's lineup out there. I do want to keep an eye on the Lions running back situation because I mentioned Sailors before. He's available on DraftKings. And if we get two of those guys out, or two indications that maybe Vaki and Robichaud aren't going to have the work, Sailors could actually play a little bit more than I think most people would give him credit for. And because he's got the multi-talented skill set, probably playing with Kyle Allen too. Some interest there in Sailors. It really depends what the news shakes out on the running back side. And you mentioned Rocket Sanders. Just somewhat intrigued to see if this player that we once saw back in the day in college can peek his head out in the NFL preseason and try to get himself onto a practice squad. Probably not making this roster. Not sure if he'll make any roster, but this is his chance to really shine, or at least one of his chances in the preseason, and I expect him to be treating it very, very seriously. It's going to do it for the preseason breakdown of the Hall of Fame game. Kyle, best of luck in your contests. For Kyle, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll be back again all throughout the preseason to break it down here on RotoGrinders.